Welcome to another edition of the Backyard Professor podcast series. Coming at you live from the Rocky Mountains here in lovely Idaho. I'm Kerry Schertz, the Backyard Professor. I continue discussing the astronomical aspects of the men Horus, Perseus figure, the celestial axis, the pole of men, which shows, in my opinion, that Joseph Smith is not wrong to associate the hypocephalus as an astronomical instrument. The storm gods is a widespread phenomenon in the ancient Near East, and this includes Yahweh, of course, the biblical God. And I analyzed some biblical Hebraic meanings tying in the storm gods and their poles, which is the celestial axis, the throne of God, the Asherah pole, the Yggdrasil world tree of our Norse ancestors. The ancient goddesses were also sky goddesses with the gods, interestingly enough. The colors of the gods have a role in this also. And I analyze Ezekiel, Amos, the Psalms, Revelation, Luke, John, and the New Testament, so on and so forth. The storm god's main function is the fertility of all things, the vegetation, the earth, the animals, humans, and the gods and the goddesses. And this is why I believe this is such a remarkable thing to find this aspect of the eternal life process associated with the cosmos as well as in the earth life in the Joseph Smith explanations of the hypocephalus. So without further ado, I'll continue on with this podcast.
As I was summing up on tape number 1, the Orontes was anciently called Typhon. According to the legend, the riverbed represented the tail of the monster when crawling away after his overthrow by means of thunderbolts. Seth is identified by the Greeks with Typhon. We are still near the conquest of Seth at the Sandal City close to Panopolis. And 2 Antiochian writers have already proved helpful, and another, John Malalas of the 6th century AD, says it was Perseus who controlled the river with a thunderbolt. Now, this may not be an earthly river. Now, Wainwright doesn't say that. This is my speculation based on the newer research, Wainwright's 1935, based on Ulansey and Jenkins and Feidler and others in the astronomical context. This river is overthrown with the thunderbolt, is controlled with the thunderbolt. We saw Perseus as the controller of the precession of the equinoxes. Now, anciently, the heavens were water, especially to the Egyptians. Joseph Smith mentioned that in facsimile number 1, of course. Represents the heavens and their waters. The heavens are the waters. Typhon was a huge serpent, and Malalas says that the Orontes, or the river Draco, the serpent. Now, see, this is a constellation. And it's a very important constellation to the Jewish rabbis in the Zohar and the Bahir and the Sefer Yetzirah. This is the ancient Teli, which I will also analyze also eventually. But anyway, as he was previously called, this river Draco, or the serpent, had once swollen to a dangerous degree by a great storm. On Perseus's exhorting the people to prayer and religious exercises, a ball of thunder fire fell down from the sky, stopped the storm, and restrained the violence of the river. The thunderbolt was wielded by Perseus, another sky god. Yes, in Syria at least, Perseus was clearly a god of the heavens, for not only could he still the storm, but he controlled the thunderbolt as well. And Min is identified as a thunderbolt god along with Perseus. Wainwright says that on page 156. Keeping in mind that Perseus, Ammon, Min, Amen, brings us to Jesus, who, according to Christians, was the ancient god Jehovah in the Old Testament, and I will show later on in some of Wainwright's other studies the intimate close ties with Yahweh, Jehovah, as a sky god. So these connections have reverberations throughout the context of many of the ancient civilizations, up into the civilization upon which our Western civilization has been based. The Phoenician writer, Sanchoniatho, says that Kronos' weapon was made of iron. Iron came from the meteorites, and the meteorites are the thunderbolts. Wainwright says this on page 157. Kronos' weapon, passed to Perseus, has many more representatives of the thunderbolt. thunderbolt was figured on the coins in some ancient cities as the weapon of Perseus, as the symbol of Perseus. We know Kronos was an old sky god. Perseus was one also. His nature as being like the meteorite and the flash of the lightning. He came flying to the attack through the air, and like the air itself, he was invisible because he wore the cap of Hades. Notice he has upper world and underworld associations. This is very similar to Osiris in the Egyptian realm. This last characteristic, interestingly, he says, is reminiscent of Ammon, Min's other self, whose name meant invisible and was originally determined with an empty space representing the invisible air. Perseus, then, was one more of the many personifications of the sky and its phenomenon, and he was identified with Min. On page 158, Wainwright discusses how the pole is also associated with Min, and the bull's horns were surmounted on top of the horn, on top of this pole. The pole, of course, representing the celestial axis, absolutely, connecting the heaven and the earth. On page 159, Min is called the white bull. He's very ancient and is mentioned occasionally all through history. Montu, at least, has some relationship with Min. His bull also, but Montu wore Min's feathers. And Min's feathers are seen on Ammon in our facsimile number, let me check this real quick, facsimile number 2, figure 2. You can see the feathers going all the way up out into the rim of the hypocephalus, which represents the celestial ocean. This is the great celestial ocean. And this, of course, is Ammon. Wainwright further contends it was in Ptolemaic times when Min, Horus, and Wadjet formed the triad there. This same triad is seen in figure 7 in facsimile 2. Min is the seated figure. Horus is his tail and feathers, or wings on his back, and Wadjet, of course, is the Wadjet eye. On page 160, Wainwright discusses how the star and the bull and the pillar of the stars are connected with the pillar of Nubia and the bull of the sky. And this is identified with Min, who actually was identified with a pole and a pillar, who was himself a thundering sky god, and a shooting star is the thunderbolt, according to Wainwright. And this is had from the beginning with Min and with Ammon. Ramses III hymn to Min, he notes this on page 161, says, I am Min standing upon the mountains after conquering all lands. See, this is the dangerous nature of Min and his white bull, which is a common characteristic of sky gods. They conquer. He is the conquering bull, which is discussed on the rim of our hypocephalus as well. He is the great bull, bellowers and roars. Like the bull, he bellows and roars, and this is a characteristic of the storm gods. And he notes this on page 161, notably in the cases of Ammon and Seth in Egypt, and Raman, who is Hadad in Babylon, and Yahweh in Palestine. They all have this association with the bull and roarings. And he's shown striding upon the mountaintops. And of course, the mountain is the ancient home, the temples of the storm gods.